Thank you so much for joining back. We are back together for our first session, which is Evolved Electricity Markets and Regulatory Pathways Enabling RE Integration. Um, we have with us a very dedicated panel today, whom we will be shortly introducing. Let me just give you a quick introduction for this session. The Government of India is working to deploy unprecedented levels of renewable energy onto its power grid. The planned large-scale integration of RE by India warrants that the country addresses the existing barriers to effective power procurement. Central Electricity Regulatory Commission or CRC and the Ministry of Power have responded proactively to the need for a market-based mechanism that enable RE integration and develop a more robust, unified national electricity market operated by a power exchange in the day-ahead and intraday timeframe. This session today focuses on sharing the learnings on evolved electricity market and regulatory pathways, enabling our integration in electricity markets, and also discusses a way forward. We will quickly present, some of the findings from the work which we have done, and then it would be followed by a panel discussion. But before that, let me introduce and invite our first speaker for this session, Shri Sanuj Kumar Jha. Shri Jha is the Secretary CRC. He's an officer of the Indian Administrative Service. He is currently posted as the Secretary at the CERC, Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, the central regulator in the power sector in India that functions under the provision of Electricity Act 2003. Among others, the function of CRC is a framing of regulations for determination and regulation of tariff for interstate generation and transmission of electricity, and so on and so forth. Mr. Jha has worked in various capabilities with the state governments of Sikkim, Jharkhand, as well as Government of India and the United Nations Development Programme in the past 21 years of his careers. He has plenty of experience in working in a broad range of sectors, including district administration, rural development, planning, training, tourism, and so on and so forth. It gives me great pleasure to invite Shri Sanuj Kumar Jha to deliver the opening remarks for this session. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Monali. Very good morning to everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to be present here and addressing you all in this national conference on large-scale integration of renewable energy in India. I would also like to thank the USAID team for inviting me for this event. I understand this is the concluding chapter of years-long Greening the Grid initiative supported by the USAID. This conference is also well-timed in my view, because since just about 10 days ago, our country, India, has reached the 100 gigawatt mark in establishing the renewable projects on 15th of August. The Greening the Grid initiative of USAID has focused on many relevant issues in the power sector and has attempted solutions with great success through pilot projects, peer-to-peer exchange programs, capacity building workshops. I have myself been associated with the USAID team for the last about 4.5 years since I have joined CRC in April 2017, and have personally noticed the good work done by the team and found that there is significant progress in preparing our stakeholders for meeting the challenges on account of integration of renewable energy. CRC and the GTG program team, they have worked closely in several endeavors. GTG program team has supported us in providing technical assistance through conducting simulation and modeling studies, which have helped in appropriately formulating regulations. GTG program team has also played significant role in supporting several state electricity regulatory commissions in the implementation of scheduling, accounting, metering, and settlement of transactions in electricity. In short, what we call SAMAS framework. It has also supported in drafting and finalizing forecasting and scheduling regulations in many states. Renewable sources of energy have become primary mode of energy addition in India as well as in many of the developed countries of the world in view of its obvious advantages. In fact, the developed countries have aggressively and successfully adopted renewable energy in a big way. As far as India is concerned, apart from setting a target of achieving 175 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2022, we have also set a target of 450 gigawatt by 2030. And several policy initiatives are being taken at the level of the central government as well as the state government. As regards CRC, we have been quite proactive in providing the enabling regulatory framework for large-scale integration of renewable energy. Many of you would be following the regulations framed by CRC, and I would like to inform you that while the draft regulations are proposed and final regulations are notified, the Commission gives a special dispensation to the to development and integration of renewable energy, be it the ancillary services regulations, the draft which has been recently floated, the sharing regulations, or the power market regulations. We have been we are currently working on a few more regulations, such as the new deviation settlement regulations, the general network regulations, and the grid code that we plan to bring in a few months. In these regulations also, the endeavor is that the renewable energy would be given a special place. The policy initiatives of the central government and the regulatory framework created by CRC would help in meeting the challenges posed by large-scale integration of renewable energy in the Indian grid. At this point, I would also like to thank the GTG program team in supporting the government as well as CRC in these endeavors. In fact, partnership between governments, regulators, and power and system operators of the US and India have created enduring bonds that will strengthen India's efforts to advance its clean energy transition to meet its commitment to climate action. I look forward to continuing engagement with USAID through its new energy program, the South Asia Regional Energy Partnership. Needless to mention that the role of POSOCO, Power Grid, NTPC, distribution companies, other generating companies of the states is also very crucial in achieving the renewable energy targets. They have demonstrated leadership and support on these innovative pilots and activities as of now, and I hope the same would continue in future also. In the end, I would like to once again thank the USAID and GTG Rise team for organizing the event and inviting me. The sessions that have been planned for the next 2 days are going to be very interesting and would help a lot in learning. I hope the discussions are fruitful. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanoji. Really appreciate the cooperation and the collaboration from CRC. We're looking forward to also continuing our partnership. So, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the presentation, the context setting presentation, which will be made by Anish Mendel, who is the pilot manager at USA GTG Rise Deloitte India. To quickly give a two-line introduction to Anish. He's a partner with the Power and Utilities Consulting in Deloitte, and has over 10 years of experience working in specialized areas including future of energy, new energy, battery storage, EVs, power market redesign, and renewable integration. So he was leading the work on the power market redesign and the NUR which GTG Rise within GTG Rise. So it gives me a great pleasure to invite you, Anish, to make the context setting presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Manali, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be part of this event, um, and happy to be leading the context for this event as well through a presentation. So I'll be briefly explaining what's the kind of work we did as a part of GTG Rise under the regional coordination pilot, which is a major part of it was supporting CRC and as well as POSOCO. The entire power market design or redesign for the last 3-4 years, we have supported CRC. We'll just quickly go through the kind of support we provided and also the key learnings from the program, because that's more important to shape up the future of the overall power market. So while I saying that this is, the country or the nation has transited from chronic deficits to a surplus, and also our kind of overall peak, if you see, is almost more than double than what's the installed capacity is, whereas when you compare with all the other countries, the ratio is not that skewed. Third, there were kind of, we know that it's a concurrent subject, and therefore scheduling takes place more in the silos within the state regions. So there have been discussion papers by CRC highlighting the inefficiencies in the cost in terms of the overall system cost can be reduced if we resort into a centralized kind of a power market and dispatch. And the fourth, what we see is the overall liquidity in the power exchanges are pretty low in the volumes, like 4% of the overall traded, where in a country like almost 90% is under long-term PPA. So it's an appropriate moment for CRC to kind of think about redesigning the electricity markets, because renewables was making inroads in a big way, and therefore with renewables, a certain number of or a lot of flexibility was required, both in terms of absorbing the renewables in the grid, but also to kind of enable that through a market framework. And therefore, that was an appropriate moment for kind of bringing in the sector change and as well as power exchange reforms. So if you see the three pillars, if you can go to the next slide. Yeah. The key guiding pillars for any kind of market transformation is kind of ensuring adequacy, which is like at any point of time, there should be enough electricity in the grid to kind of meet the overall demand, right? So that's the adequacy. Now, how to meet that adequacy is through, again, through long-term PPAs, short-term PPAs, medium-term PPAs. There could be kind of markets for that, which is in the West called capacity markets. So designing of that. The energy, which is again, as we said, the liquidity was pretty low in the power exchanges, but how to increase liquidity in the power exchanges so that more of buy-sell can be done through the exchanges itself, through short-term markets, and therefore you get a price which is much more optimal and much more optimized than a long-term PPA. And third is, of course, once the gate closure, once these markets kind of end, then any kind of imbalance in the grid will be settled through the ancillary support, where POSOCO or the system operator takes over and balances the system through ancillary services. So these are the three broad pillars of any electricity market, and therefore CRC kind of came out with a lot of discussion papers. Their thought leaderships on areas like MBED, on RTM, as well as ancillary services, which are market-based procurement of ancillary services, and then capacity market also to some extent. And there are I would say mentions about it. So these are some three pillars through which the entire redesign was envisaged. Now, if we the overall envisioned power market for the future, if we see, as again, there is a long-term market, which anyway is there for us, almost 90% or more than that is a long-term traded electricity market. If you compare it with the West, the long-term market, of course, is there, but the percentage of short-term versus long-term trade is not so skewed. There are medium-term contracts as well, and 3-4 years ahead, even 8 to 10 years ahead, PPAs are signed in the West region, and that's done through again capacity markets, more through the concept of resource adequacy. Again, there could be concurrent, I would say, states versus central kind of, I would say, subjects, and as well as the electricity markets, but still the capacity market can work centrally as well as decentralized manner. And in the short term, you see usually the markets are structured on a day-ahead basis, which is operating day -1. And then in the operating day, there could be markets, right, real-time markets, which could be through auction-based or through kind of continuous bilateral market, which is intraday market, which we also have. So these are some of the markets. And then once the gate closure, once the operating day, or I would say any kind of trades, say stop after real-time market, then the system operator takes over through and balances the system of any imbalances through the ancillary services. So that's how the market for the future looks like. And this is becoming utmost important because of renewables coming in, because of the variability of the renewables. Therefore, there will be real-time, I would say, flexibility is required, real-time balancing requirement. So therefore, you will see, or you have already seen, real-time market has gained traction. A lot of liquidity has increased in the real-time market. There could be certain more interventions probably required to make it more liquid when renewable also starts participating in the market. And then ancillary market also, as Mr. Charles pointed out, the draft regulations are already out. There are a lot of revamps being planned in the ancillary services market as well. So we'll quickly go through the real-time market. This has been one of the, I would say, important or key milestones which has already been achieved by Government of India by introducing real-time market on 1st of June 2020. And since then, there have been a lot of successes which we have seen over the years. The prices earlier, kind of real-time market prices, were a little lower than the day-ahead market prices. But recently, what we have seen is both the markets are converging. So that's been, again, a great achievement. So yeah, I think as part of GTG Rise, we supported CRC in this intervention through international best practices, how the international markets work, what are the implications, and how real-time markets are launched, whether it's auction-based, whether it's kind of continuous. There are examples of both in the US and Europe, different time frames, different kinds of market. So we brought in the pros and benefits of that. And then any kind of market intervention when we brought in. So what needs to be, of course, seen is what are the different benefits, or what are the benefits of introducing the market, and how it gets impacted by all the participants. So whether the participants, especially the Indian distribution utilities, whether they would be benefiting for this introduction of the market. So we did a benefits modeling by simulating the power exchange environment for 5 or 6 states, and established that yes, introduction of real-time market is necessary. There will be enough liquidity, and correspondingly kind of real-time market will help the utilities as well. But however, the lessons learned after introducing real-time market, I think Mr. Cha has already pointed out, there is a need for linking DSM prices to the kind of day-ahead prices, or the higher of the day-ahead prices of real-time market. And when ancillary market is also gets introduced, the higher of the DAM, RTM, or ACE prices. When there was day-ahead prices, then of course ACP or whatever DSM prices was linked to ACP. But at the same time, now real-time market is operational and ancillary market will be operational. There could be a need to kind of link it with all three of them. DSM again is UI or frequency linked, but there could be a need for identifying, and as well as kind of coming out with the cause of prey principle for identifying the ancillary services charges as well. Bringing renewables into the market is again a big step for increasing liquidity, and as well as kind of enabling flexibility through the market itself. If you reduce tolerance bands, which is right now 15%, and again, FOR has done kind of a study, internal study for a few states, knowing that what's the actual deviations by these renewable generators, and it's been seen that almost 90-95% of the time the deviations are much below 7.5% or 8%. So therefore, there is a need to reduce these tolerance bands, and therefore asking these renewable generators to come and participate in the real-time market to meet the imbalances, if any, on the real-time basis. And then again, the shortening the lead time, and GTG Rise again has supported and is supporting POSOCO for introducing the NOAR, or the National Open Access Registry, for implementing that. Once this is implemented, this is again envisaged to bring down the lead time substantially from, say, right now 7-8 time blocks to almost 3-4 time blocks. There is a need for uniformity in get closure concept across all SERCs. There are still some variants for SGS and ISGS stations, and as well as renewable generators for 4 blocks and 7, 8, 10 time blocks. So those needs to be uniform again to make real-time market more liquid. Similarly, for market-based economic dispatch, again, a kind of a discussion paper was introduced, but before that also we did simulations, we did benefits demonstration, and as well as international case studies, how it operates. And again, this was introduced, and we supported CRC on all these aspects. And we already see that MOP has, of course, come out with a discussion paper on MBED as well, the phase 1 of MBED, because the kind of discussion paper talked about a big bang approach of kind of completely centralizing the market. There's a need to relook at because of stakeholder comments, and it's because of the huge amount of change. So probably a phase-wise approach makes sense, and MOP has come out with a discussion paper on that. And the phase 1 only entails about bringing in the NTPC thermal generators into the foray. And from the pilot or from this particular implementation, the learnings which will come will of course pave way for the future market transformation as well. I'm not going into the details of how it looks like in the future, whether all REs can participate, hydro can participate, because that's again as for the learnings it will come. And the third pillar, as we said, ancillary services market, which is again a draft regulation has been out. We supported CRC again as a part of GTG Rise. On the review of international best practices, we brought in experts like international agencies like NREL also supported, E3 also supported and all. And as well as we did an extensive kind of market best practices review of both EU and as well as US markets on ancillary services, how this can be market procured or market-based procurement of ancillary services. There were again draft simulations done on several models so that to ensure which kind of models can be introduced, and again through a roadmap basis. The discussion paper talked about kind of a fast tertiary services. So as a part of a final draft regulations, we see 2 separate products. There is a secondary regulations and there is a tertiary regulations. The secondary regulations will be, of course, to start with, will be a regulated procurement. And then the tertiary, both up and down reserves will be procured through the market. The bids will be, of course, collected through the exchanges, and then POSOCO will clear that. POSOCO will do the clearing, and then a uniform MCP will be discovered for TRAS up. For TRAS down, it will be a pay-as-you-bid kind of a principle. Then there are commitment charges. Those who are cleared in the day-ahead basis but not dispatched, of course, will be given the 10% of the MCP as commitment charges as a part of TRAS up. TRAS down. And secondary regulations, again, we have brought in several principles of batteries as well to participate, new technologies to participate, and that's about it. So the resource adequacy bit is again one of the important discussions going on, and therefore the next discussion would be about I think I'll leave to Manali to introduce, but the next discussion will be again on resource adequacy and how important would be that for the Indian context. And yeah, over to you, Manali, on the paper presentation, launch of the papers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anish, for setting the context and also speaking briefly about the presentation to follow. But before that, we have a short video on the work which GTG Rise did on the power markets and the NUR. So I will request AV to please play it.
Energy sustains life and renewable energy empowers our sustenance. India is at the threshold of a transitioned energy scape as it accelerates the integration of huge amounts of renewable energy into its power grid. Unprecedented levels of clean energy would become available, strengthening the country's energy security and reducing its economy's carbon intensity. Renewable energy is slated to power the nation, but it also comes with challenges. Significant variable renewable energy integration can pose challenges for grid reliability and security. Modernization and evolution of our power systems that can balance demand and supply, ruling out any mismatch in real time, is the need of the hour. As part of the US-India Strategic Clean Energy Partnership, USAID is committed to supporting India's clean energy transition powered with renewable energy. The central component of the program, the Renewable Integration and Sustainable Energy or GTG Rise initiative, supported improving the regulatory and policy framework for developing efficient wholesale power markets, enhancing grid reliability and much more. Through this initiative, USAID supported India's central regulator, the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission (CERC), in its transformative vision of redesigning and implementing the day-ahead, real-time and ancillary markets. Launch of the RealTime Market or RTM by CERC has placed the Indian electricity market in the league of advanced wholesale electricity markets globally, paving the way for a more efficient electricity market for India and smooth integration of renewable energy. Discoms will now be able to purchase millions of units of power in spot markets just an hour before delivery. A process as simple as booking a cab online just an hour before traveling. Establishment of RTM is a landmark initiative to drive the country's shift from inflexible long-term contracts to shorter-term contracting and electricity spot markets. RTM will enhance the capacity of the country to meet 24/7 power supply requirements in a flexible, efficient and dynamic way. Besides aiding India's power market, RTM platform may help India create a common electricity pool for trading power in the South Asia region. USAID also supported the National System Operator, POSICO, in the development of a National Open Access Registry, NOAR, to ease power trading. NOAR will be a centralized electronic platform to automate short-term open access approvals processes for intraday market to operate more flexibly.
This NOR is going to bring everybody on board on one platform so that ease of culmination of the total process very easy. Harmonious data transfer from state to region, region to national, back to the dissemination of information. So this is going to facilitate in one shot. Open access consumer also knows where the availability are, what is the transfer capability limits, how much it is there, so he can have a clear vision. All the players will learn at the same time and there is no error.
NOAR will facilitate easier and accurate reporting, monitoring of the market and surveillance by regulators. It will provide an audit trail of applications and a dashboard summarizing details of the applications made, approved, rejected and pending for grant of short-term open access. This strategic clean energy partnership between the United States and India captures their resolute commitment to a cleaner and sustainable environment, the two watchwords of the 21st century.
I hope you enjoyed the video. So we now move on to the next presentation for today's session. We have two eminent speakers, Dr. Nikita Biankar and Shruti Deora from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, making a presentation. I would quickly give a brief introduction for both the speakers and then invite them to make the presentation. So Dr. Nikita Biankar is a scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and a senior scientist at the Center for Environmental Public Policy of University of California, Berkeley. He also serves as a guest faculty for the Executive Education Program at the University of California, Berkeley. He has conducted extensive research and policy analysis on a range of key energy issues such as renewable energy, energy efficiency, electric vehicle, and energy access in United States and key emerging economies such as India, China, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Moving on to introducing our next speaker, Shruti Deora, Affiliate, International Energy Analysis Department, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Shruti has conducted research on regulatory and policy issues in grid integration of renewable energy, along with transition to electric mobility. Her focus area includes regulatory aspects of transition to renewable storage and its impact on capacity planning and market design for the evolving sector. Prior to this, Shruti worked as an advisor, renewable energy at the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, India's apex power sector regulator. It's a great pleasure to invite both the speakers for making a presentation on recommended resource adequacy framework for India. So over to you, Nikit and Shruti.
Well, thank you very much, Monali, for the kind introduction. So moving on, we are going to talk about resource adequacy framework for India. Can you move on to the next slide, please? As Anish showed in his presentation, clearly over the next decade or so, there are significant changes coming onto the Indian grid. And over the last decade, significant changes have already happened. So let's quickly recap what are the major changes that have really happened in the Indian grid over the last decade or so. They're fantastically summarized by Anish in his presentation, but let's quickly go over that. Number one, we are in an excess capacity environment. Especially relative to what is really needed to make even individual state peak loads. So this is indeed an historical time. One can always argue that do we really have an excess capacity, because currently the demand went over 200 gigawatts and the states where some of the states were struggling meeting that high demand. So do we really have that excess capacity? That's really that's a good question for debate, but in general, there seems to be enough capacity available on the bar. On the other side, on the demand side, the demand has been changing pretty rapidly over the last 8 to 10 years, primarily because of increasing urbanization, industrialization, and so on. So the chart here shows the average daily load curve for 24 hours for the state of Delhi, just as an example. And it shows the load curve for the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2019. Unfortunately, it may not be entirely clear, but the limited point here is that the red curve is the 2010 load curve, and the pink curve is the 2019 load curve. So over the last 10 years, there are three major changes that have really happened in the load curve. Number one, the load has gone significantly peaky. The load factor has been consistently reducing. The growth in peak load has been much higher than the growth in overall energy requirement. The second change is the peak load hour has consistently changed. So typically Delhi used to be an afternoon peaking load, primarily because of the space cooling and air conditioning load. But what has happened over the last 7, 8, 10 years is because of the increasing penetration of residential air conditioners. Last year, 2020, unfortunately, this chart doesn't have the 2020 data, was the first year in which Delhi was not an afternoon peaking system. Delhi system peaked at 1 a.m. in the morning, primarily because of the residential air conditioning system being turned on at night. And the third major change that has really happened is because of the peaky demand, the difference between the peak load and the average load, or a difference between the summer peak load in particular, so June and July, and the average load in other months has increased significantly. For example, in June and July, the Delhi peak load could be as high as 7,000 megawatts, whereas in other winter months, November, December, or so on, the Delhi load could be as low as 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts. As a result, the Delhi utilities may still have to have firm capacity, firm contracts to meet 7,000 megawatts of peak load, but not use that capacity for most of the months in the year. And this creates a major problem for cost effective, what we call as the resource adequacy, or cost effective capacity to meet the peak load all the times of the year, also including some of the contingencies. Now, the third thing that has changed, just to recap, first is excess capacity, second is changing load shape, and Delhi is just an example. Similar things have been happening in other states as well. The third thing that has changed is even today, the large scale, more market-based sharing of resources among states, it's still not entirely happening. There have been a few ad hoc kind of efforts, there have been a few bilateral efforts, but it hasn't really happening at a large scale using formal markets. And as a result, what is happening is the coal PLFs have been dropping consistently because of peaky load, because of increasing penetration of renewables, because of states not being able to share resources with each other. And the coal PLFs have been dropping, causing significant financial stress on the existing thermal assets. Next, please. Now, the next big change, can you go back one, please? Now, the next big change that that has just started happening and will play a major role in the coming decade is shifting of the agricultural load from nighttime to solar hours. So this chart shows the average daily load curves, actual load curves in the state of Karnataka in the year 2018, before Karnataka's agricultural load was shifted from nighttime to solar hours, and in the year 2019, which is the blue curve, which is after nearly 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of agricultural load was shifted literally in a span of few months from nighttime to daytime. And you can see the remarkable difference in the overall load curve. So now this again plays two major impacts on the system. Number one, it makes integration of solar energy significantly easier. On the flip side, it also reduces the nighttime load, so making the thermal power plant operation even less financially attractive. And interestingly, because it is agricultural load, it doesn't really make a huge difference to the evening peak load around 7 or 8 p.m. because as it is, there is not much agricultural load served in those hours. Several utilities have already started shifting agricultural load, and as you may already know, Maharashtra, Gujarat, AP, Telangana, and so on and so forth. And what we expect is over the next 8 to 10 years, nearly 40 to 50 gigawatts of agricultural load could potentially be shifted from nighttime to daytime. And again, that has a huge implication on how solar resources could be integrated, how thermal resources are operated, and what is the impact on the overall system peak load, and by corollary on the resource adequacy. Next, please. Now, the next big thing that may happen over the next decade or so is naturally a large penetration of renewable resources. So with 450 gigawatts of renewable resources, the grid integration challenges and in corollary, the resource adequacy challenges are going to be significant. And how and why is explained on this chart. So this chart shows the average load curve. These are projected, okay, for 2030 in red, and the average net load curves. Net load is load minus renewable energy. Average net load curves with 450 gigawatts of renewables in the year 2030. So there are pretty interesting observations from this chart. Number one is what we can call these as India's duck curves, and since California has already claimed this duck curve terminology, let's call it India's peacock curves. So there are interesting observations from India's peacock curves. Number one is this curve is significantly deep. So look at the month of April. The net load curve reaches close to zero. So this significantly increases the risk of renewable curtailment, really requires very low thermal technical minimum levels, requires energy storage, and so on and so forth. The second important observation is steep ramps this net load introduces during the evening ramp up period, particularly after the solar starts dropping down. And third, despite nearly 450 gigawatts of renewables, such a little contribution, especially during the October evening peak, such a little contribution during peak periods. So the effective peak contribution of 450 gigawatts of renewables could be as low as 30 to 35 gigawatts. And again, this creates a major problem when it comes to meeting the resource adequacy requirement or meeting the load, especially the peak load, in a reliable manner. Next, please. So the conventional wisdom, as we have seen in several other planning studies coming from some of the central government agencies, the conventional wisdom is the only way to meet the evening peak load is building additional thermal capacity. So, for example, if India continues in that pathway of building 450 gigawatts of renewables, but also continuing the thermal build out, particularly to meet the evening peak load, this pathway generally becomes extremely risky. So that is definitely a pathway to meet the system peak load, also maintain that healthy resource adequacy margin, but also results in significant financial risk to the sector. So because you keep on adding more and more thermal capacity, about 160 gigawatts of thermal capacity, if one adds here per the current CEA plans, about 266 gigawatts of thermal capacity, if one adds, nearly 160 gigawatts of that thermal capacity will operate at base load at pretty economical rates. But over 100 gigawatts of the coal capacity by 2030 will likely operate at a PLF of less than 40 to 50%, and some could operate at PLFs of less than 20 to 30%, thereby significantly increasing the average cost of generation from those specific power plants. So this conventional approach of meeting the resource adequacy requirement by building thermal capacity in the wake of renewable addition is definitely not cost effective. And therefore, one really has to rethink what could be interesting other approaches for meeting this resource adequacy requirement in a renewable heavy world. Next, please. So we conducted some assessment of how could you meet three objectives of meeting the resource adequacy requirement, at the same time meeting the system operational requirements, and at the same time balance the power system and the least cost possible. So what we found is 450 gigawatts of solar and wind is actually cost effective for India to build. But for meeting this resource adequacy requirement, we only need 229 gigawatts of coal. So not really 260 or 270 gigawatts of coal, but nearly 40 to 50 gigawatts of less coal. But in lieu of that coal, since renewables don't add much to the capacity value of the system, you need significant amounts of energy storage. In particular, nearly 60 odd gigawatts of energy storage operated about 4 to 6 hours every day, plus significant amount of load shifting, nearly 50 to 60 gigawatts of load shifting from nighttime to daytime, that essentially can operate the system in a reliable manner, in a cost-effective manner, and can still meet the resource adequacy requirement. I'm not going to go into the details of exactly how the system dispatches and so on and so forth. But again, the limited point here is that one really has to look beyond the thermal capacity build out for meeting the system peak load. Now, this system, because of the falling prices of renewables and batteries, becomes much cheaper than a counterfactual system, which is dominated by thermal and so on. But more importantly, this also leads us to several interesting regulatory strategies that one really needs to pick up to make to meet the resource adequacy in the most cost-effective manner in the possible. So number one, one of the important regulatory strategies is really states sharing the resources with each other, including the firm capacity as well as the energy resources with each other. Energy resources can essentially be taken care of through markets, but sharing firm capacity with each other really needs to be assessed, and some innovative solutions could essentially be could be introduced. The second important regulatory strategy is one has to think about resource adequacy and the overall utility planning and procurement in an integrated manner. One cannot really think of in a renewable heavy grid. One cannot plan the system in one dimension, and one cannot think of meeting the resource adequacy and the reliability in the other dimension. Both really have to be done together. And third, a comprehensive policy environment really has to tie in all these regulatory as well as other market related design issues together. So I'm going to request my colleague Shruti to talk a little bit more about what are those regulatory strategies and give us a little bit more details on what do they actually entail. Shruti, over to you.
Thank you, Nikit. Am I audible?
Yes.
Great. Namaskar and good morning to everybody. So as Nikit mentioned, our objective is to really realize the least cost resource mix over the next decade and beyond. And some of the current practices might not get us there. So for example, the current practice of procuring conventional thermal capacity up to state level peaks might have contributed to an oversized system that we currently have today. So how do we really ensure that we have a reliable, flexible, and robust system in future, but minimizing costs to the end consumer? So that is where a resource adequacy framework comes in. And so just taking a step back, by RA requirement, resource adequacy requirement, all we mean is what is the firm capacity required to meet the system demand at all points in time for a given reliability target. And the way we determine it is take the national coincident peak, the system peak, plus a planning reserve margin, which is the additional capacity needed to maintain the reliability, and that can account for your load forecasting errors, your unexpected generation outages, or even your operating reserves. So on the right side here on the table that you see is the output from our modeling study for 2030, which is basically showing what is the RA capacity, the excess RA capacity every region will have in 2030. So as you can see, the northern region has a lot of excess capacity, whereas the southern region seems to be deficient. And all of this is for the particular least cost scenario that our system models, which basically shows that this is the southern region is going to more or less rely on the northern or western regions to meet its capacity needs. And the reason for that is usually you want to build the resources wherever it's cheapest, and this does not really indicate the energy flows, but really the capacity availability. So how do we make sure that we can facilitate sharing of capacity resources in a seamless fashion? And currently, right now, as Nikit mentioned, there are certain mechanisms that are already in place where you have the banking between states, you have unrequisitioned surplus on ISTS plants that are being shared by the different beneficiaries, but really taking the next step and creating an institutionalized framework to incentivize those states or discoms which might have excess capacity to share with the states and discoms that are short on capacity. Because as we all know, there is a lot of load and resource diversity in India, whereas Karnataka system peaks around March, Delhi peaks around June, July, and Maharashtra peaks around August and September and October. So how do we utilize this diversity to minimize consumer costs? So we want that Delhi should be able to import during its peak months, which are June and July, from other states that might have excess capacity at that time. And so for that, what we need is a new type of contract, what we term as the RA, or the resource adequacy contract, and we'll talk about this in a minute. So what are the different components of an RA framework? And again, a bunch of these components are already in place, and some of these are already being worked upon with current reforms that are ongoing. For example, your draft Indian Electricity Grid Code, and CERC has obviously issued regulations on real-time markets and ancillary services. So starting with accurate forecasting, which is the key input to a reserve margin study, what is really needed is to have some sort of a standardized forecasting practices, so that there are some aligned methodologies that different states follow, possibly ensuring that they're statistically rigorous and accurate, and standardizing, let's say, the variables and the data sources. So all of it can be rolled up to a more usable national load forecast. And then determining the capacity requirement, or the RA capacity requirement, and assessing how much is that need for a reliable system, and allocating it to the states on the basis of the state's share of the national coincident peak. And that is potentially not possible in the short run, and I'll just talk about it in a minute. Then when the states get their RA requirement, they have to account for all resources that they have. Currently, they might be looking at only the thermal dispatchable capacity, but potentially wind has some capacity contribution to meeting the peak during monsoon, or you have hydro that can be used more optimally. So you have to account for all the resources, and in future battery storage as well. And then figuring out a capacity sharing mechanism, which will be short to medium term contracts, so that a DISCOM that is short on capacity can get capacity from a DISCOM that is long, or a generator that might not have a long-term PPA in place. Our analysis shows that such capacity sharing can reduce total RA requirement by around 10 gigawatts for the Indian system, leading to thousands of crores of saving every year. So this recommended RA framework is based on international experience, specifically the US. In the United States also, different regional markets have different implementations of the RA program, specifically in terms of how the compliance is, but they mostly have all these common components, starting with the reserve requirement study, which sets your total RA requirement. It creates the planning reserve margin based on the input load forecast and a system reliability target. And then you take this RA requirement and allocate it to states or DISCOMs, but create mandatory RA requirements for each state. And we'll talk about the compliance penalties. And when the states get these RA requirements, again, saying that what is the capacity credits for different resources, which means that what is the anticipated percentage of the nameplate capacity of a particular resource that will be available to meet your load in the peak hour. So making sure that that happens for all different types of resources, including renewables, hydro, and storage. And for compliance purposes, the DISCOMs can sign a contract. In the short term, DISCOMs would need to have the scheduling rights for all the capacity that they want to schedule. So right now, it is possible to have a short-term RA contract which has this component of transferring scheduling rights, but in the long term, it can graduate to a capacity market. And really having penalties in place if the compliance is missing, because that actually shifts your incentive for having for balance and from your real-time DSM penalties to a year-ahead RA program. We also looked at the different design options for an RA program. So a couple of dimensions. One is the scope, whether the program is designed at the state level or the regional or the national level. And as you go broader, your total capacity requirement reduces as you are able to use the resource and load diversity more. And the other is the compliance cycle. So whether you look at it at a monthly basis, on a monthly basis, or an annual basis, when you do on a monthly basis, your regulatory effort might be higher, but as you can see, such a program will have about 20 gigawatts lower capacity requirement than if it was done on an annual basis. So again, I'm just going back to our assumption for all this analysis. One is we are assuming a 15% planning reserve margin, but also that in the near term, the states and DISCOMs should be able to schedule their energy up to their peak demands until there is a national centralized electricity market, such as the market-based economic dispatch that is implemented for India. So these are the different types of RA markets. To begin with, simplistically speaking, on the left, the current framework is that each DISCOM operates their resources in silos with some basic level of sharing. But what we are suggesting is in the short term, the DISCOMs can have some sort of bilateral contracts, even though they are competitively bid, which will allow, let's say, DISCOM 1 to share their excess capacity with DISCOM 2 or 3, where the DISCOM 2 gets the scheduling rights for, let's say, 2 months of summer for the excess capacity that DISCOM 1 might not need. And these contracts could be facilitated on existing platforms such as DEEP, and they would enable better utilization of existing assets. In the longer run, though, we can move to a capacity market, and that would need a national centralized market, and all the capacity must offer obligations in the day-ahead or real-time energy market, so that you can make sure that the capacity is available to the DISCOM when it's needed. And also in the US, for example, California has bilateral capacity markets with a monthly compliance cycle. On the other hand, PJM and MISO have centralized auction-based capacity markets. And as Nick had mentioned, this really needs to integrate very well with the state level planning and procurement. So once the state knows that this is what the RA requirement is, it looks at its load resource plan, and it meets its short-term needs through the capacity and energy contracts. And for the longer run, to procure new resources, our recommendation is to go the all-source competitive solicitation way, because separate solicitation for different resources results in a suboptimal mix, because right now you would only be looking at per kilowatt hour cost, but what you really need to look at is what is the value of the resource to the system. So an economic analysis tool like capacity expansion model would let you account for interactions between different resources and really tell the state what is that least cost portfolio of different types of resources that would meet the RA requirement. And then one can sign the long-term contracts accordingly. So just to conclude, we have seen that India's power sector, we are expecting, has to navigate a real period of really rapid change in this coming decade. And especially with high renewable energy penetration, there will be some new, unique challenges for maintaining system reliability. And these challenges have changed as the resource mix continues to change. And a comprehensive RA framework, which is very well integrated with the resource planning and procurement processes at the state level, would be essential for maintaining reliability and meeting the load at least cost. And last but not the least, streamlining the sharing of resources among the states and DISCOMs will reduce overall capacity requirement and hence the end consumer costs. So with that, thank you very much. Over to you, Monali.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nikit and Shruti, for the very interesting presentation. We now have a panel discussion to deliberate on some of the things which you both covered in your presentation. I'll quickly introduce our moderator for the session, Shubhranshu Patnaik, and then hand it over to him for introducing his panel members and taking forward the discussion. So Shubhranshu is the leader for the power and utilities sector in Deloitte, India. He has over 24 years of experience in power consulting, spanning sector restructuring, business transformation, public-private partnership, power markets, and transition to clean energy. Shubhranshu was the chief of party for USAID's GTG Rise initiative until March 2019 and is currently the senior advisor to the program. He leads Deloitte focus on the future of energy, encompassing renewable energy and its integration, role of battery energy storage, digitalization of utility, power market reforms, and so on and so forth. So I'm really pleased to invite Shubhranshu to please take forward the discussion. Over to you, Shubhranshu.
Thank you, Manali, and good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. So we have a fairly high-powered panel today, and what we'll be discussing is the role of power markets in renewable energy integration. So let me quickly introduce the panel. We're running a little behind time, so I'll just keep it brief, but these are all well-known people, so I don't need to do a long introduction, thankfully. So Sri Vijay Mengani, Chief Engineering, Central Electricity Regulatory Commission. Sri S.S. Barapanda, Director Market Operations, Power Systems Operation Corporation. Sri Rajesh Kumar Mediratta, Director Strategy and Regulatory Affairs at India Energy Exchange Limited. And of course, Dr. Abankar, who stays back from the last session. He brings interesting perspectives from an international context, joining us from LBNL. So let me start the panel off by maybe bringing Mr. Mengani in, because CERC has been at the center of driving quite a few changes in the power market. They put out a pretty bold vision of redesigning the market across all three timeframes, starting with, of course, the day ahead, but also the real-time market and ancillary. So, sir, if I can ask you, how do you see this enabling RE integration going forward? And what are the other regulatory and policy measures afoot, along with the introduction of these three changes in the market.
Thank you, Subhrashu. I'm audible.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
First, I will congratulate my earlier colleague Shruti and Abhankar to have a very good presentation and also to a good insight given by Anish Mandal. So what are the progress being made? And both of Mr. Anish Mandal and Subhrashu are quite closely working with the CRC, so they have a lot of insights. And say, I will say, in the last 2 years reform process, the contribution of USA and Deloitte is a very appreciable and applauding. Whatever you got earlier, KPMG was working with us. Then we have come up with some draft paper. But from draft paper to the journey of the regulation, the team of USA and Shubhanshu has helped us a lot. So I will just go through the whatever changes which we are suggesting. All are good desire. And to convert this desire into the fruitful regulation, we have to work hard. In 2016, when I left the CRC to go to the CA, we were moving from a good transition period from a conventional to renewable energy, and just India has started giving its target for the 175 gigawatt. At that time, people were asking that India would not be capable to integrate so much of the power. But in last 5-6 years, through a flexible regulatory mechanism in the cooperation of POSOCO, we are able to successfully integrate around 1 lakh gigawatt of power. So in the flexibility, not only in the flexibility in the regulation is required, flexibility in all the operational parameters, from all the value chain, from generation to the consumption, we were able to modify our behavior. And what I will tell Mr. Abhankar, that in 2018-19, I was also associated with the CA planning study. And at that time, we were working under certain constraint, and visualizing the 2030 was based on whatever input we give to our integrated resource planning software. In last 2-3 years, lot of new wisdom has come. So we are agreeing with the new study which has been done by Lawrence Berkeley, that we have to rethink our all options, and we are not closing any option. So from CRC side, what we are doing, in the Anish Mandal's first slide, it was shown that 3 major areas are there. One is the flexibility, then the adequacy, and the availability of the power. So in all the 3 areas, we are working closely. And what we have done a good data analysis. Before going to any regulatory in CRC, we have created a new environment of simulation. That whenever we create a new regulation, we try to simulate existing behavior and analyze how the behavior will change after the coming of new regulation. And certainly whatever regulation or previously we have implemented, like RTM we have implemented, with the help of POSOCO we have implemented SCED. We have seen quickly the consumer behavior changing. In earlier regime, what was happening, the most of the DISCOM was withholding the power to the last moment. Now through these 2 mechanisms, we are able to provide them 2 mechanisms to have their portfolio optimized at the last moment. So one is available before 7 blocks, and then from SCED, from POSOCO side, from central scheduling, we are trying to optimize the plan. So this has gone into our new 3 regulation, which we are forming now. One is the Ancillary Service Regulation, another is our GNA regulation, and third is our DSM regulation. All 3 regulations are integrated based on our experience. And what we find, that if we can change the regulatory behavior, and one most important thing is, whatever we think about 2016 to now, everything is being thrown on the renewable integration. Before that also, my demand side variation was too large. So all these 3 things which are being done actually requires in 2016. So in the regulation of ancillary services to DSM, what we are trying to do, that the balancing cost should also be equally distributed. It should not be that all the variability of either from demand side or either it is coming from renewable side should be unbalanced, or it should be loaded to other agencies. So our new regulations will certainly provide that optimization in the deviation settlement, cost of deviation, and the procurement of ancillary services should be done from the optimal power procurement. And during these exercises, we have done enough state activities also. that we have involved in state also. Like I will give you one example. In 2017, one experiment was done between Rajasthan and Haryana. It was found that the Rajasthan can put off his Suratgarh unit number 4. He was already operating it at the technical minimum because it was not cooperating well with the other state, like given by the example. But we find that if Rajasthan start cooperating with the Haryana, so both the Yamunanagar power plant PLF improve. Also, the cost of purchase of power from the Rajasthan has come down appreciably. In a single day, around 16 lakh rupees saving was possible. But what was the hindrance? Actually, there was no platform available at the last moment to do the price and volume negotiation. They cannot move to the different channel to get this transaction through. So through this transaction mechanism like ancillary services, RTM, and the MBED, etc., we are trying to provide them a platform which is negotiation neutral. So through these 3 platforms, we are trying that the state should start cooperating in the collective manner. In the last 1 and 2 years, in the COVID season, Mr. Mendiratta will certify it, many states have started using market platform more efficiently than the 2 years earlier. For example, Andhra Pradesh is starting using this power procurement to reduce its power procurement cost. So all these 3 things are possible. So far as the resource adequacy is concerned, unless we go from a shortage mindset to a new mindset where optimum sharing of the resources there, we cannot achieve. So all the resources which we are creating should be considered like we are having a prototype or pilot project for battery. So in the battery project also, we are thinking how the utilization of this battery can be a widespread for the management of regulatory requirement of resources for ancillary services, peak shifting, and for the benefit of any investment which is done by new capacity or new resources should be shared with a lot of stakeholders. It should not be borne by a single agency for a long term. It should not be a binding stone. So in the regulatory exercise, what we are taking, we are considering it is a 3-leg race. That we are trying to get all the states together with us so that it should not be there that only the central regulator or central operator is having a lot of wisdom and lot, like Abhinkar said, this wisdom should be transferred to every state. And in this wisdom transfer, the USAID, etc., are helping us a lot. And Rajesh Mendiratta's organization, POSOCO, and all are helping through their different organizations to achieve us optimum power procurement and resource sharing. There was a lot of wish list which was given in the Anish Mandal's 9th or 10th slide that CRC should all these things. So I will assure from CRC, all these things are being done with a lot of good efficiency, good negotiation skill, good data analytics. And in the last, I will say, वक्त आने दे बता देंगे तुझे है आसमां अभी से क्या बताएं क्या हमारे दिल में है. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vingani. Maybe I can bring in Mr. Barapanda next to throw some light from an operator's perspective. Now that we have 100 gigawatts of renewables on the grid, but an anticipated uptake up to 450. What are the main challenges you are starting to face and you're anticipating to be addressed from an operator's perspective in integrating so much renewables onto the grid, sir?
No, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, let me congratulate Sri Anish Mandal and Mr. Nikit Abhankar for very excellent presentations. And my earlier speakers have also covered many areas. So, so I shall discuss about these challenges presently being faced and what are the likely challenges. So, first thing is now this 100 gigawatt. There are, let me classify into some sections. Say about 10,000 megawatt is ISTS connected, and which are scheduled by RLDCs and NLDCs. Then there are state connected generators. There are some RE generators which are, say, different small hydro, or there are other types of say, other types of generators which are dispatchable. So this RE generators, first thing is that this is scheduling and forecasting. CERC has brought the framework on scheduling and forecasting, and revisions are possible in case of long term. So whenever there is a change in forecast, the revised schedule, these REMCs have been installed at 3 RLDCs and 1 NLDC. Different states also REMCs have been installed. Then states also, intrastate, the scheduling and forecasting has been implemented by them, and intrastate generators, they are also trying to optimize. Then interstate, because of this error in forecasting or even intrastate error in forecasting, this ancillary service framework is there. So with the help of ancillary service framework, we are able to manage. Then CERC has done a very good thing that they have brought a regulation to bring technical minimum to 55%. So that has helped a lot, because because now thermal generators during off-peak hours, during day lean hours or during night lean hours, they are brought down to 55%. And maybe in future state generators will also go to that level, so that will also help. And coming to hydro generators, during monsoon season, many Himalayan hydro generators, they are almost full, so we cannot modulate generation. But during other seasons, they do the peaking duty, and it helps a lot. Southern region and some parts of eastern region, there are reservoir-based hydro stations, and these help system operators. So this is the present context, and in future we have lot of RE plant 175 gigawatt by 2022 and 450 gigawatt by 2030. So what I'll say is that this RE generators with storage hybrid, probably that will be a better option, because now what is happening, for example, there are different types of generators. Say some generators are selling under long term, some are short term. So those who are selling under short term, they are not able to revise. So now this RTM framework is available, and they can also make up their shortfall. So that is one part. Then if merchant generators come and they are not dispatchable, then what will happen during off-peak hours? These merchant generators, mostly they will get lower prices. Say daytime, as the curves shown by Mr. Abhankar. So prices may go low. So so merchant generators, it will be better if they come with storage. The hybrid generators will help the system in managing this variable renewable generation. This will also reduce the requirement of transmission capacity. Then this resource, again, this reserve requirement will also go down, because this intermittency and variability will come down with reserves. If reserves are co-located with the renewable generators, that is better. And even if they are located some far away from the generator, then also there is no issue. But only thing is that if they are located in different regions, then there can be some cases of congestion. So that is one aspect. Then another aspect I would like to cover, this resource adequacy discussed by Mr. Nitin Avankar. So one aspect is that sharing of capacity, that is okay. But another aspect is this retirement of old power stations. So now there is a clamor for retiring old power stations based on age. So I think that may not help our resource adequacy requirement, because what will happen, new generators are not coming and should not come also. But old generators, just because of age, if you retire, then in future a situation may come when we will not have adequate resources to meet our demand, because renewables in any case they will be available when sun is there or wind is there. So we have to ensure that we have adequate resources to meet our base load. So cogeneration, for example, these generators maybe they will be required to operate for say 1 month in a year or 20 days in a year. But if you retire them altogether, then they will not be available at all. So one aspect is that sharing of resources between the states, that is okay, that is fine. But in addition, we should have generators to serve this requirement, because if the generators are operating only for say 30 days or 20 days or 2 months, then pollution level will also they will not be contributing to pollution, because pollution will depend on total generation of the genetic station. So naturally, the total generation is coming down. So pollution contribution to pollution will also be less. So I would suggest that the generators, at least all the efficient and economical generators, they should not be retired just based on age. And capacity contracts should be there, which the generators can enter with the discoms, or between the discoms also there can be capacity contracts. So this will help in mitigating the problems or challenges of 2030. Then this storage, in any case, that is one aspect of the storage, battery storage, pump storage. For system operator, pump storage is preferable because it will give a higher duty for, it will work for more hours, more number of hours. So that is one aspect. And also it will contribute to inertia. This can support more to voltage control also. So keeping all this in view, pump storage is preferable, but both battery storage, pump storage, both will be required. And certainly with the help of storage, flexibility in generation, flexibility in transmission, we shall be able to meet the challenges of 2030. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was excellent in terms of insights and coverage. So now let me bring in Sri Mediratta ji. Mr. Mediratta, from a power exchange standpoint, where do you see the exchange playing a leading role in integrating renewables onto the grid? Are there products, solutions, services that you are working on or are getting introduced which would enable this transition to happen?
Yeah, thanks, Subhranshu. It was a good discussion so far. We heard Anish Mandal's basic theme presentation, and also saw Shruti and Ankit RA framework, and that's wonderful. Actually, we thought that when we talk about exchanges or markets, we are actually creating a right framework. As far as today, if you see, we have a day market.
So if you can come a little closer to the mic, you're a little feeble.
Yeah, okay. What I was saying that we today have a very good framework. We have a day market, we have a real-time market, and this is very rightly timed because now when we are integrating more of renewable, then real-time market will definitely play a very big role, and it is already started taking a major share in terms of overall volume in the market. If you see today, we are doing about 20% of, almost 20% of the total trade comes to a real-time market, and this is going to grow. And we have seen the same thing happening in other parts of the world where intraday auctions have played a very important role in the intermittency, and that everyone says that this is going to grow. So this is what we have done is right, and what we are going to further add is the ancillary market. And for ancillary, we are today talking about secondary and tertiary. And at one point of time, we should also think of adding primary, because if you see battery can be the deployment of battery can be hastened when you price primary reserves also. And we should not insist every generator to have a pre-governor mode of operation. Instead of that, we give option to market and then let them bring that capacity into the market and provide that primary reserve. So that can also be one area where we can think of. But today's framework is we find is good. And further, as Anish showed that in the 3 to 5 year period, we should have a financial market, a forward market. And I don't think we need to do anything beyond that because already what we have is 25 year or 10 year or 15 year PPA that will suffice. But whatever is happened, I think most of now we should think that how we can add more capacity by having a tie-up for a shorter duration. So in terms of overall time frames, so we will be covering almost everything. So with futures forward coming in, and then we have a day-ahead market, we have a real-time market. In real-time market, a few things what we can change, as Anish also said, that we can think of linking our DSM market with either day-ahead or RTM. This can be only debated whether it should be day-ahead or RTM. Some may say that RTM is going to discover a price which is very closer to delivery. That can be one parameter which we should take for linking our DSM. Besides that, we also see that we should also allow generators to play freely in the market. Today, there is constraint in the sense that they find themselves constrained in meeting their schedules, and only in case of outages they are allowed to buy from the market. But we feel that day-ahead and real time should also become almost like a financial market where somebody can buy or sell in the day-ahead, and if they find something is missing, then they can prove up their volumes through real time. I think this reform we should be doing as early as possible. And regarding gate closure, we are talking about now 1 hour, and we are seeing, and as we grow, probably we should see that it should reduce to 30 minutes, and then finally we should have some roadmap of maybe next 5 to 7 years when we see zero kind of gate closure for our real-time markets. So this was on the market side. And what a very important element we were missing so far was resource adequacy, because how much capacity is good for us? And this question always comes to mind of the states also. And if you say any state now when it wants to go for any price for any capacity, they want to know that really I need some capacity to be tied up or not. And I was very happy to see the framework which was shared by Shruti. And this also when we were actually thinking on what should be the right kind of RA framework for India, we also actually derived a similar framework that we should have something working on the national level, because no point in talking about state level, because once you have something at national level, our philosophy should be that we create enough capacity at national level, and after that, the market should provide all the tools for transferring excess to deficit areas, whether it is a capacity, whether it is energy, or it's a real-time energy. So all these three time frames, we should have markets in place where it can be transferred from resource-rich areas to deficit area. And what the calculation also showed that there will be some regions where it will be surpluses, there will be some region where shortages. But at least when we have a framework, we know that exactly when we should when we need more capacity. Today, everybody says that 380 gigawatt is good enough, but when you really come see the capacity contribution in the peak, we don't find that much contribution is coming. And maybe today you find it sufficient, but in the next 5 years, we find deficit, and then we should be talking about capacity. And maybe at national level, once you do it, and then we can cascade those RA parameters or metrics to state level to find out exactly which state should do. And then we should make compulsory kind of mandate where if there is a one state we find is lagging in terms of adding to or meeting its RA framework targets, then they should be asked to meet those things. And then as Shruti said about the right to schedule should be transferred, and that also I feel that there can be capacity contract or strips of capacity, and we should find out innovative ways to trade those strips of capacity. So today we talk about 1 year, 2 year strip. Tomorrow we should also be able to talk about diurnal kind of capacity strips where you talk only of peak, you talk of only day. So something like that. All those innovation should also happen through the capacity market. And as but she said, okay, initially we should have some kind of right to scheduling, and later we move to a full-fledged capacity market. So all of this really makes very much sense. Only thing is, I just wanted to add one more thing, that today, when we talk about capacity in India, we have a very strong notion that capacity is bundled with energy. And somewhere we have to unbundle this. So when we talk about capacity, we should only talk about capacity. So energy can be separately sold by any generator, capacity can be sold separately, and both can be traded separately. So good thing is that if you unbundle any of these products, then you are able to meet your requirement in a more meaningful manner. And that's what we should do. So the whole notion of capacity bundled with energy now should be done away with. And I think that can be one major takeaway when we talk about US markets and when we talk about RA framework. We should say this clearly, because otherwise in India, when we talk about capacity, energy is always bundled. Another thing about MBED, we find that this is working. This will be good tool. Only thing is our take is that it should be made voluntary. It should not be made compulsory, because anything in India, if you talk about compulsion, unless it is required by the system, don't impose anything and let states choose their options. So if suppose we provide a framework for doing this embed kind of model, and we leave it to states and generators to devise that, okay, where they want to do it, where they do not want to do it, I think that will function in a better manner. And that can also play a very important role in building new capacity. Today, when we talk about building a renewable capacity, it is only through PPA. And it is only through PPA today, initially by SECI or some aggregator, but finally it is concluded with some distribution company. So now this leg of the distribution company should be done away with. Now only traders should be allowed to do a PPA. The model should allow that. And then this aggregator or trader should be able to sell it in the market, which we call it embed, and then they should dispatch those capacity, because then we also make our distribution company free from tying up doing a PPA, because so far experience of every discom is bad with by doing PPA. Everybody curses that fixed charges burden is there. Why we should impose any burden on discom? We should allow discoms to move freely across the market depending on what they need and when they need, and then let the aggregator or trader should take that burden, that okay, they ensure that there is a capacity coming in, and they also make sure that this generator gets revenue for the long time. I think this was what I thought, that the whole piece should look like this. And I think whatever you have done is really great, and all are aligned. Thanks, Subhanshu, for the work done by the team. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Meridata. Let me bring in, last but not the least, Nikit, to comment on what he's seeing as evolving landscape from both ancillary as well as resource adequacy standpoint in international markets, because it's, as he put it as well in his presentation, an evolving landscape, right? Everyone is contending with more and more renewables added to the grid. So what are those things that we can take away from international experiences and adopt in the Indian context, both from ancillary as well as resource adequacy consideration? So over to you, Nikit.
Thank you. So I'll be pretty brief, and I'll be happy to expand later if there are questions. So I'll make some comments on ancillary as well as some of the capacity market, which links to the resource adequacy framework. See, on ancillary, there are three major takeaways. Takeaway number one is ancillary services have to be seen in the right context. So for example, ancillary services, I'll give you an example of California. California ISO operates a very thriving ancillary services market. PJM operates a very thriving ancillary services market, but the overall value of the ancillary services market in the broader energy market context is only about 1 to 2%. So even in a high renewable energy heavy system, ancillary services overall value contribution is fairly small. That's number one. Number two, the ancillary services market is, and this is despite the fact that there are several other flexible market products available. For example, there is a thriving day-ahead energy market, there is a real-time market, there is an energy imbalance market. In addition, utilities have significant access to natural gas-based power plants, and despite that, the contribution of ancillary services is fairly small. So one also has to be realistic in terms of setting expectations on what ancillary services can add to the grid. So the first major takeaway is before jumping the gun all the way to ancillary services, one really has to make the existing energy markets more flexible, more deeper, and more wider. And currently, India is exactly in the right step in creating the real-time market and so on and so forth. Now, the second major takeaway from this, and especially from India's context, is going forward, the ramping requirements and the overall need for such ancillary services is only going to increase pretty rapidly. For example, so the current, and Barpanda sir, you may correct me if I'm wrong. So the current typical ramp that is met by the Indian system is approximately of the ballpark of 600 to 800 megawatts per minute. And by 2030, what we are expecting with 450 gigawatts of renewables, this may increase up to 1000 to 1200 megawatts per minute. So, and this is also in the context of falling thermal capacity, which so far has been kind of providing some level of ramping support. So again, so this kind of ancillary services, ramping support, or some kind of reserve requirement would definitely increase, but there are other resources that can also provide that services, and it depends on how those other flexible contracts are made. For example, how the battery contracts are made really changes the way what kind of capacity gets bid in the ancillary services market and how ancillary service market runs. So the second takeaway is treatment of the existing flexible resources really changes the way ancillary service market design would look like. And then the third key takeaway, which is not really for ancillary services for that matter, is really links capacity market as well. And this also links to what Mr. Mediretti was talking about, is one really has to design some of the innovative products in the ancillary as well as capacity market context. For example, can we think of some capacity attributes when we design a capacity market? For example, there was some mention of can we think of a capacity that is only made available just during the evening peak periods or morning peak periods, during the summer peak months, or during the net load peak months of September or October, and so on and so forth. And that really changes the way the resources are added. And sorry, one other issue that I forgot to mention is, given that the overall value of ancillary services is still likely going to remain small, one also has to be realistic on what kind of resource investments just ancillary services by itself can drive. For example, no battery storage capacity can be supported only by the revenues of ancillary services market. It has to have some additional either energy arbitrage or capacity market revenue in order to remain afloat in the market. So again, one just has to fine tune the expectations from ancillary services. They're absolutely critical, they're needed, but they have to be seen in the right context. So let me just pause here and see where we go. Over to you, Shubhranshu.
Thank you. I think that was great, Niket. Great insights. So we are actually overshot time a bit, but I'll take just one question from the audience. Let me see who I can direct it to. It is about, we spoke about energy markets, we spoke about ancillary and capacity also. So this question is around development of transmission infrastructure. And how does that get developed? So maybe Niket, I direct it to you. I know I'm catching you by surprise, but this question has come from the audience. How does in all this the transmission infrastructure, doesn't get deprioritized? How do we focus on that getting developed adequately through either regulatory or market provisions? So if you can throw some light on that, probably that's one question we can take.
Sure. So transmission again becomes the most critical, quote unquote, missing link, pun intended, in all this. So there are multiple ways in which transmission investments could be encouraged. One is just by some level of regulatory kind of mandate, or for example, the regulator does some transmission assessments and just orders utilities or approves utilities investments to build a minimum level of transmission connectivity. The second level is really introducing some kind of financial incentive like congestion pricing or the transmission right of way pricing and so on and so forth. And the third and more interesting is using battery storage or energy storage in general and compensating those storage resources for avoided transmission build out costs as well. So that may reduce the overall transmission requirement. But in general, I mean, I don't have anything additional to add apart from the fact that regulators have an extremely crucial role in making sure adequate transmission investments are made.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think, unfortunately, we ran out of time. We'd have otherwise stayed engaged with one more round of questions. I had a few noted down, but we've completely run out of time. But this was very, very interesting. I think each one of you brought great insights to the table. So thank you again, Mr. Mengani, Mr. Balapanda, Mr. Mediratta, and Dr. Abhankar. I hand it over now back to Manali.